On the platform with me I have Margaret MacDonald of the Scottish National Party, Teddy Taylor, Conservative MP, Norman Buchan, Labour MP. But it is to the studio audience in particular tonight that I shall be looking. An audience drawn from every section of Scottish life to bring you an expression of Scotland's thinking on this subject. In a further programme, we hope to visit Wales, but tonight, the voices of Scotland. And let me start straight away with those voices and with the audience, and let me suggest the situation in which the government fails tomorrow in its guillotine vote and the whole bill is endangered, the whole devolution bill is endangered. I wonder what people here think will be the effect on Scottish thinking or on Scottish life if that does in fact happen. Gavin Kennedy in the front row.
Well, the Scottish National Party would take the point of view that if the government failed to deliver their promises of 1974 and their continual commitments to deliver those promises, then they have no alternative but to resign and let the people of Scotland pronounce upon them in a general election. Our view is quite clear. Labour saved its bacon in 1974 by promising an elected assembly with strong economic powers. If it doesn't deliver in the guillotine, the only honourable solution for them is to resign and let the people of Scotland pronounce in an election, which would then, of course, be mandatory, that the people of Scotland do want an elected assembly with economic powers, and that the Labour government has got no further pretence to govern if they don't deliver that.
Alex Scott, may I hear from you, please?
Well, that sounds very reasonable, but I'm afraid that if this bill is talked out, the same thing will happen as happened when Gladstone's Irish bills for Home Rule failed in the 1880s. The Westminster politicians, by playing at party politics, will hand over the situation from the reasonable to the unreasonable to people who start blowing things up, and we'll unfortunately find ourselves in a situation where people start getting hurt.
You seriously envisage a kind of Northern Ireland situation here in Scotland, Mr. Scott?
I'm afraid so.
Thank you very much. Moira Winter at this stage, please.
Should this guillotine fail, I'll be very dismayed and distressed, because I believe the people in Scotland do want devolution, and I'm afraid if we don't have devolution and the guillotine fails, in effect, the result will be that other parties in Scotland will capitalise on this and make people take the wrong decisions for the wrong reasons, and we could be confronted not with an Irish situation, but a period of extreme unrest and disquiet in Scotland for a very long time.
Right, thank you very much. Teddy Taylor, the Conservative Party is doing quite a lot to try and stop this bill and will vote against the government's guillotine tomorrow night. Is it doing so with due respect to these kind of views that we've heard just now?
Yes, well, quite frankly, I would deny that these were representative views. All I can say is that, I mean sincere, all I say is I represent a constituency in the middle of Glasgow. And what I can say is that the vast majority of my people are talking to me about jobs, about unemployment. They're talking about prices. And the one issue which very rarely they raise is this issue of devolution. And I would suggest that these are far from being representative voices. What I would say is that if we implement this crazy bill, in my view, this is the one thing which will ensure that Mr. Kennedy's friends in the Scottish National Party will have a heyday. Because this bill will cause extra expense, it'll cause confusion, it'll cause constant breakup between Scotland and England, and the only sure recipe, in my view, for causing a great deal of conflict between Scotland and England is to implement a bill which, in my view, is the worst possible way of going about devolution.
Norman Buchan.
Well, I think the first point to be made is that Teddy Taylor has two adjectives. One is ludicrous and the other is crazy. I think this bill.
True talking about
I think that this bill would work given the will of the people to make it work. I agree with some of the dangers that's been enunciated if we fail on the guillotine tomorrow. Certainly what we would do, Alex Scott talks about violence, I don't know about that, but I think we would write in border politics into the Scottish political system for the next 20 years.
What does that mean?
Well, I mean by
precisely?
that I think that what should happen is the bill should go through the House and it should be submitted to the will of the Scottish people, along with a second question which says, do you want independence? This would decide if they wanted to operate devolution or if they wanted to go further. That is the first and most important essential. Therefore, if it fails, it seems to me what we must now put to the Scottish people, having failed to talk it through the House, Alex Scott is quite right. It's not the government that's failed in this, it is the House of Commons that has resisted it, in particular the Tory party. Therefore, it seems to me we should go straight on then to the double-pronged referendum. Do you want a devolution of this kind And do you want independence and let the Scottish people decide? Given that, I believe the House of Commons would then pass a devolution bill if the answer to that was yes.
Margaret MacDonald.
Oh, really? The politics of the border. What you're seeing right now, because the natural inclination and the expressed desire of Scots at the last general election, that is in favour of devolution, because that will is being thwarted by the House of Commons, not even by the whole House of Commons, because I give you gentlemen credit where I don't give it to some of the blimps, the English blimps on the back benches, who are in a nutshell. Oh, Norman, he's got troubles. He's in the Tory party. He's got enough brother.
Doing very well.
The blimps in the back benches of the Labour Party in particular in the north of England are beginning to say things like Scotland is not going to get an assembly because an assembly looks as though it might be a good idea and we're not getting one, so therefore Scotland can't get one. Now, if you can tell me anything that will exacerbate any frustration more than that sentiment will, then I'd be very interested to hear about it. If in fact you wish to continue with harmony and fellowship throughout the United Kingdom, then the Scots must be allowed to follow their own inclinations and their own desires just now, which do include the retention of the spirit of the United Kingdom.
All right,
and I wish to goodness they would understand that in the House
Margaret
of
MacDonald,
Commons.
let me broaden it out and let me hear from some of those other voices in Scotland who are perhaps less enthusiastic for devolution than the ones I heard at the start. George Lawson, you were indicating you wanted to speak in the front row here.
Yes, I would say that this bill is being claimed by the Scottish Nationalist Party as due to them, and there's a great deal of truth in it. The reason why the Scottish National Party has blossomed in this past couple of years has been because the two major parties have run away from it. The bulk of the Scottish people, in my judgment, are sick and tired of this, and they want to live at peace and in harmony with the folk south of the border.
They want jobs.
The organisation I represent, which is Scotland is British, take the view that over the past 270 years, the Scottish, the English and the Welsh people have become one people.
Miserable altogether.
And this bill, our view is that this bill will disrupt the nation, and therefore we want to see this bill scrapped. And I'm sure I'm speaking for an awful lot of Scots when I say that.
Right. Okay, Jenny Chapman in the front row there, please.
Yes, from the Scottish
Let the
Liberal
microphone find you. Thank you.
I feel that this discussion is going the wrong way because people are taking a very dramatic attitude to this. If the guillotine is defeated tomorrow, then this is the end of the bill, they say. Why is this so? The guillotine is not normally the decisive factor in a bill. The point is that here we have a very bad bill, which is generally agreed to be bad, but we have an even worse debate in the House of Commons. Now, the government have to try to get a bill through that House of Commons. The only way they can do it is by bringing a constructive attitude themselves. They haven't had this attitude so far. A lot will depend tomorrow on the circumstances in which this guillotine is proposed. If it is proposed in a constructive way with concessions to those who actually want to improve the bill, who recognise that it is a recipe for conflict, if they want to make concessions, then they may find they can get their guillotine through. If they don't, that's not the end, then they can rethink. They've got a bill which people want to make better. They can think about a second guillotine. This is not the end of the road.
Can I ask you all for as short as points as possible, and that's not to suggest anybody's been too long. What I'd like to do just at this stage is Mr. Lawson spoke and introduced Scotland as British movement. I'd like to just stay with that for a moment. I'd like to hear from Mr. Devereux in the front row there as a representative of the business world to some extent and the views of the business community. Then I think I'd like to hear from a trade unionist, Mr. Fairley, in the front row as well. Mr. Devereux first.
Well, the business community has this view about this, and that is that it's all in favour of devolution, when devolution means one having one's own responsibility to perhaps spend a bit of one's own money and a little bit of individual choice, which we haven't had so much in this country in recent past. We're all for devolution in the sense of doing local jobs more efficiently, and we've got a very high measure of it in Scotland today. But what the CBI is opposed to is this bill, which is a hodgepodge, which is introduced for reasons of political expediency. It adds to the net cost of government, and in the long run, it is likely to cause a lot of social unrest because it just won't give people what they want, which is more jobs, more security, more money, lower prices, and this bill will do none of that. It will worsen the present situation.
Thank you very much. Jimmy Airley from Govan Shipyards. Will it bring jobs?
I don't think it will necessarily bring jobs, though. I'm for the bill. I think it's certain weaknesses, but the alternative, in my opinion, would fracture the cohesion and unity of the United Kingdom. And it's my opinion that this bill is necessary in order we can tackle the fundamental problem. We just say this point. It amazes me to hear Teddy Taylor say that people in Scotland and Glasgow are approaching him about prices and jobs. If they're worried about prices and jobs, and I agree that working people are worried about their cuts in their living standards and jobs, they're wasting their time approaching Teddy Taylor and his party because their solutions would be worse for the people of Scotland. But I'm fundamentally for the bill with all its weaknesses.
Right, gentleman in the red tie on, John Maxton, I think, correct? Yes.
Yes. Could
A
I
very,
add
a very,
what Jimmy-
a very famous name, I should say.
Could I add to what Jimmy Early was saying? Because in fact, Teddy Taylor's position on this is a very unique one, because I am his opponent in the next general election in Cathcart. And you should see his last election address on devolution, because he very clearly stated in that he wanted a Scottish Assembly, and he wanted it with economic powers too, with certainly stronger powers, and in fact this bill suggests. And can I make one other point, and that is that we're getting very concerned with the political side of this. I want the Scottish Assembly because I want an extension of democracy in Scotland. I want more control over civil servants in Scotland. We have our own civil servants up here.
Do you not like control
And on
over the
their
money,
own.
John? Would you not like control
No, I
over
don't.
Scotland's resources and Scotland's
what
money?
I want is the matters that the Secretary of State handles at the moment brought under the affairs of Scotland, because he is responsible for the civil servants at the moment, and they should be brought under political control, and they're not.
Right. Mr. Wiley, you're from Aberdeen, you're a businessman. Aberdeen is the place where the oil comes in and where one sees this pot of gold, as it were, arriving. Do you support the idea of devolution?
With a small d, yes, and it would take too long to qualify what I mean by that. Could I say that we in Aberdeen take the view that an assembly such as is proposed in the White Paper is as remote from us as we are in Westminster? It would mean a possible domination from this area. I see Mrs. MacDonald shaking her head.
Well,
but
an assembly can break up Strathclyde, so therefore you don't have the
perhaps
domination.
break up Strathclyde, Mrs. MacDonald, but is this necessarily in the best interests of Strathclyde?
Most certainly, and I think everybody will agree.
Margaret, I'm going to go round the platform in a minute.
We've got an area here. We've already got a local government reform a year or two back. Are we now going to throw another tier of very expensive government onto something that is not necessarily going to work?
All right, Mr. Darcy's been waiting to come in, and then I'll go round the platform, I think, for quick responses to what's been said up to now.
Well,
Mr.
you
Darcy.
know, I think we've came across a very strange phenomenon here tonight. If I could go back to Mr. Lawson, who is active in the Keep Scotland British campaign. The remarkable thing that I find is this, that the people who are active in that campaign, including Viscount Weir and Mr. Lawson, they never came out with that slogan when we were discussing the common market.
Here, here, here.
Because all of them were supporters of the common market. Now, I think this government, in spite of the weaknesses of this bill, it's the only government yet who has produced a feasible bill, to their credit, even although there are weaknesses. The Royal Commission was set up in 1969. The Tory government ignored the recommendation on devolution. The Labour government has carried out its promise, even although there are weaknesses, and I think it's to their
made,
credit.
I think, Mr. Darcy. Thank you very much. Mr. Taylor, you've had the most attacks upon you. I think you should speak first from the platform.
Yes, indeed, with the most attack. What I hope the audience will do is, quite honestly, do what people in Scotland, I'm sure, are doing in increasing numbers. They don't realise it. And that is to think, how will people in Scotland be better off if this bill goes through? And quite frankly, when you look at it, all it will mean is we'll have an extra 200 assemblymen in Scotland and Wales, and an extra 2,000 civil servants, and £39 million will have gone in establishing and running these assemblies for 1 year. Now, John Maxon, of course, is always very critical of me. He's my opponent in Cathcart, and good luck to him. But all I'd say, John, is you were down in Parliament on Tuesday of last week, protesting about cutbacks in teacher training colleges. You'll know from our constituency, people are concerned about home helps being cut. They're concerned about school crossing patrolmen going. Now, how precisely is it going to help these people if we're going to spend £39 million setting up this nonsense, which in my view will do no good to the people of Scotland and simply be a recipe for conflict? Conflict is what made of this.
Well, bring us closer to independence with the money to pay for your home helps and so on, Teddy. That's why you don't want it. That's why
Margaret,
George
this
Lawson
is the only
doesn't
people who
want
are enthusiastic about this bill, and I think we must be frank about it. The Labour people aren't enthusiastic about the bill at all. They justify it. There are very few. All I'd say is I've been down in Parliament sitting through these debates. They've been good debates. There have only been 2 MPs, from my knowledge, who have been actively supporting the bill.
Are you
All there is
enthusiastic,
a
Mr.
concern
Buchan?
about it.
Are you
And so
enthu-
all I'd say is that we've got
Mr.
to
Taylor,
admit...
please.
Sorry.
Are you enthusiastic, Mr. Buchan?
Yes, I think I'm one of the 2 MPs he's referring to.
That's 3, Norman, 3.
That's true.
That I would like to pick up Jenny Chapman's point, which I think was, with respect to a number of the points that were made, is perhaps the constructive point, when she says, now look, this is not the end of the line. A guillotine fails tomorrow because of the bill, then the task is to see if we can get an open, what the Italians call uomo aperto, open man, to have a look at it to see if we can improve the thing. The difficulty there is that one man's improvement is another man's opposite.
Job.
And that I really think what we should be doing is to say to the Scottish people, do you or do you not want it? If that happens, then you will get not only the will in Scotland for it, if you had the security that we wanted or didn't want independence, wanted or didn't want devolution, but also the security in the House of Commons. It would then get through the House of Commons. There's no question about that. Now, can I say this point?
Quickly, Norman, please.
Yes, quickly.
Thank you.
Can we separate the financial and economic? Finance-raising powers we want, so that if we want extra things, we should have it. But the major economic things, if this was split off, as Margaret MacDonald and the SNP want, a total separation, then in my constituency alone, for example, I'd lose 12,000 jobs tomorrow as a result.
Thank
So
you very much.
that's not on. Let's distinguish
But
between
you're
the two
losing
things.
them already, Norman.
Can I come to
12,000
Professor Alan
jobs
Tate?
tomorrow.
Professor Alan Tate, you're an economist. What do you think of these arguments up to now?
Well, I think the economics of devolution are the economics of disillusion. I think that on the whole, Scots look at the governments we've had over the last 20 years in Westminster and they say, well, neither the Conservatives nor the Labour Party have done other than produce high unemployment and low growth rates and one of the poorest performances in Europe. And they say, you know, could Scotland not be... it couldn't do any worse anyway, could it?
That's
I mean,
right,
that's the way
that's
it's put. But of course, the question which then has to be answered is...
Could they do better?
Could they do better? And what would it be that would really make it better? I mean, would labour productivity increase overnight? Would strikes disappear? Would mobility in labour appear? And these are the things, would these actually change? Now, the evidence up to date is that, on the whole, in Scotland, these things are, if anything, somewhat worse. But would an assembly actually produce a change in climate which would enable a really substantial change in the real underlying economic elements in Scotland?
Right, Andrew Curry and then Jimmy Milne of the Scottish TUC. Andrew Curry first.
Surely the real problem about
Just
Scotland's economy...
Start again, please, Mr. Curry. Thank you.
Surely the real problem about Scotland's economy in the post-war years is that for most of these years we've had the wrong economic policies applied to Scotland. We've had policies which perhaps suited Britain as a whole, but which didn't apply to Scotland. And that's one area where simply having a parliament in Scotland making economic rules for Scotland would help. The trouble is, of course, the present devolution bill doesn't do that because it doesn't really provide any worthwhile economic powers at all. And to me, the only point of the present devolution bill is it's an indirect help, because it does give us, for the first time for 200 and something years, a forum in Scotland where the people in Scotland can decide what framework they want for their future government, because it should be the people of Scotland who make that decision, not Britain as a whole.
Mr. Milne, can I just put to you the points that were made, in fact, by Professor Alan Tate, that would there be greater mobility of labour once the devolution, the Assembly was there? Would there be fewer strikes? Can the Scottish TUC deliver?
Well, but I'm surprised that Professor Tate didn't ask the other question, will there be more investment in industry? You know, why should it be assumed that it's strikes?
He asked three.
I know, but it's significant that he doesn't ask that question. But it seems to me that I think that there's no argument about mobility of labour. As a matter of fact, Scots have been walking across the border for years now to find jobs in Corby, in Birmingham, London and elsewhere. So mobility of labour is not an issue. But to me, I agree very much with Norman Buchan. I think that there must be a fair element of economic power residing. You see, I agree with George Lawson in a way. We are saying devolution, yes, separation, no. So that George Lawson's argument is a non-starter, because of the fact that we are certainly not arguing for separation.
Question.
Yes,
Can I ask
please
a
do,
question?
please
yes,
do.
Jimmy Milne, you and I have fought a few battles in common and have roughly the same attitudes. Now, it has been admitted by people here who share these attitudes that devolution can't actually get to the root of your particular problems, which is 183,000 people unemployed, no prospects, lack of investment in industry, lack of powers to direct the Scottish economy. If devolution can't do that, why don't you want to try independence?
Neither would separation, Margaret.
But we can prove that your way doesn't work. We've tried your way and it doesn't work.
Neither would separation.
All right.
But we've tried your way and it doesn't work.
Back to your corners, please. Back to your corners. Now, who was waiting to come in? Mr. Deans, I think. Yes. No, gentleman there. I'm sorry, with a striped shirt. Is that Mr. Fawkes? I'm sorry. Yes, I beg your pardon.
George Fawkes, Labour
Yes, sorry, I
candidate.
beg your pardon.
Teddy Taylor's very good at being destructive. I've seen this on many occasions. Now, Norman Buchan has put up very clearly what the Labour government's proposals are: devolution, not separation. We know what the SNP proposals are: total separation from England, from our cousins.
Define separation.
Well, all right.
Define it.
That's your job.
No,
well,
I'm not a separatist.
It's
I'm
clear.
for independence.
I think it's clear what your policy is.
I would love to hear this definition.
All right.
Margot, nobody will hear anything.
What I'm trying to get at, Margot, I'm not attacking you. What I'm trying to get at is Teddy Taylor, because what is the Tories? No, what is the Tory policy? Because he has been demolishing everyone else's policy, but he hasn't put up anything constructive as far as Scotland is concerned.
All right, I think
typically Tory.
I'm going to have to take a break in a moment. I think it's a good time for you perhaps to tell us what the Conservative
indeed,
Party...
I'd be very
Will
pleased
a
to.
minute be long enough, Mr. Taylor? Yes.
I've been trying for 10 years.
All I'd say, George, is I wish you were in Edinburgh at 2:30 this afternoon when Francis Pym made the clearest and most helpful and constructive statement. What he said is, the Labour Party is in a mess with their bill.
No.
We've had 2 shots at it, quite frankly, and haven't got it right. And so what we are proposing now is we think there is a case, if the guillotine fails tomorrow, or if the guillotine doesn't fail, that we should in fact have all the parties coming together to see what improvement we could get in the government of Scotland. I'm afraid the Tories would find exactly the same problem. I think you'd find the same problem no matter which recommendation came forward. It probably wouldn't go through Parliament. So what we suggested is all party talks to find the right solution. In the meantime, all we're saying is, George, your stupid Labour bill is rubbish.
Is this the idea of Mr. Pym's idea for the convention, Mr. Taylor?
Yes, the convention. Yes,
No, it's just to buy time. That's Mr. Pym's
All right,
idea.
all right. Thank you all very much for the moment. I'm going to have to take a break there. At the start of the second half, may I hit Hugh MacDiarmid? You are a lifelong Scottish nationalist and also Scotland's, I think nobody will argue with me, greatest poet. How do you feel the argument has gone so far? Hugh. Yes, please.
I've got no interest whatever or concern with devolution of any kind at all, any degree. I want Scottish independence and ultimately a Scottish republic. That's not a new idea. You see, but the majority of the Scottish people don't want that. The majority of the Scottish people don't know any more than they've ever known what they want. In any case, they couldn't want what I stand for, because until quite recently, Scottish schools, colleges and universities had no courses in Scottish literature or the Scottish languages. They were entirely conditioned by English standards. I want to break away from that. I want complete disjunction from England. I've appeared in Who's Who for the last 40 years or so, and given my hobby is Anglophobia. That's not a Scottish peculiarity. It's common all over the world. Perfid Albion wasn't invented recently, but in America, you saw notices, no limeys need apply. That kind of notice was never put up against any Scot, anywhere in the world. Lord Acton said that no small people had had such a profound impact on mankind at large as the Scottish people. That is perfectly true. And what I'm concerned about is to maintain those characteristics of the Scottish psyche that enabled them to achieve that position. We can't do it under the present party political system. We must have a fresh start, de novo. And what I was asked to do tonight was to speak about the things that are more important than any party political issues. Edwin Muir, the Orcadian poet, said in a letter, "It seems a pity that Scotland should always be kept back by England, and I hope the Scottish Republic comes about. It would make Scotland worth living in. Christopher Grieve, a strong nationalist, Republican, socialist, and everything that's out and out, thinks that if Scotland were a nation, we would have Scottish literature, art, music, culture, and every other nation seems to have, and we haven't. I think that would probably be likely.
McDermott, I'm going to have to stop you there, I think. As an Anglophobia, any Anglophiles here? Yes, back row there, gentleman in the back row, yes.
Yes. Paul Burns, Tory candidate. One of the things I resent very much about Mrs. MacDonald's party is the fact that they're separating me from my nation's capital, which is London, and they're cutting me off, or they seek to cut me off from what must be the most successful political alliance in the history of the world. One of the points I would like to put to the panel is this. Can we justify having 71 Scottish MPs at Westminster if these proposals go through?
I'm going to answer you first of all. You see, you're dreadfully worried about my party separating you from your nation's capital. Well, my sister lives and works in England, and I am going to feel no more separated from my sister who lives and works and is part of the English community after Scottish independence than I am just now. Because that is what the United Kingdom is worth, and that is what is worth preserving.
Yes, Margot, but once you have your customs barrier at Carter's Bar, what then? What of your separation then?
Kate Stewart, please. Is that not you? Are you not you? Yes.
Anna McCurley, another Tory candidate. I think Mrs. MacDonald keeps fudging the issues about what separatism and independence are. I want a clear-cut definition from her. I've asked her before on radio for this. I got nothing the last time, and I want her comments on what Hugh McDermott has said and whether there's any source of agreement there. Because if she's in that party and he's in that party, I want some consensus in that party.
Listen, Mrs. McCurley, until your own party can agree on a policy, you should keep quiet, dear, about consensus.
I don't think,
now
dear,
then,
that I wish
Mr.
I
McDermott,
just two shapes.
Mr. McDermott is not in the Scottish National
If you
Party.
speak, ladies, if you speak one at a time, you will do much better.
She did the same thing on radio.
A very bad bill from the Labour Party
All right.
or independence.
Thank you.
We're going to have
Well, I'm
independence.
going to come round this side of the room. Mr. Curry, Mr. Carty, I think you've been waiting to speak. Thank you.
I'm a Chrysler shop steward and very much involved with my colleagues in the South in relation to retaining Chrysler in the UK because it was a vital part of the Scottish scene that Chrysler was retained. And as far as we're concerned, we're obviously anxious that we retain that type of unity that we have with our colleagues elsewhere. When we're dealing with multinational companies throughout the UK, then we need the closest relationship that we have between them. That does not mean to say that we're not in favour of devolution. We are in favour of the bill. We don't think that everything's going to change overnight simply because we have devolution or a bill that might not please everybody.
Mr.
But
Carty,
it's a fact that we must have it at this time because the Scottish people and the promises that have been made, and as far as we're concerned, we will be insisting that the guillotine applies in that bill.
Mr. Carty, I mean, you're on the shop floor. I mean, is it a burning issue on the shop floor, or are the issues the same issues as they are in any other factory of jobs and of unemployment and of wages and things like that?
The issues are always been the same between us, between those at the top and those at the bottom. And the position is one where we're continually attacking those at the top. We want to get devolution so that we can bring the problem near us, so that we can attack it with a more united Scottish voice than what we've done before, in conjunction with our colleagues in the South, so that we can tackle these problems.
All right.
If the guillotine's defeated, or the bill becomes defeated, it will become a burning issue in Scotland. We're for devolution as it stands in spite of all its weaknesses.
All right, one at a time, please. Mr. Andrew Kerr, you've been waiting to speak. Andrew Kerr in the front row, please.
This is becoming a very lively week.
Yes.
The Empire's dead. I think the UK is dead.
Yes, the way it is just now it is.
And I must say, it's very good to have reached this stage when one thinks back to Hugh McDermott's great friend, J. Leslie Mitchell, when he wrote in
a Scottish scene with Hugh, and he said, "I should love to follow Wendy Wood, that other well-known Scottish nationalist, south of the border, and her saffron-kilted Scots, even although I may die laughing by the wayside." That is no longer the case in Scotland.
Yes,
the spirit has got to rise again.
Laurie Buchan wanted to make a
I'd
point.
like to come in, Leslie
All right.
Mitchell, of course, who contributed along with Chris Gree with Hugh McDermott over all these, as he took diametrically the opposite point of view on that. He said he was fed up and sick and hearing of small nations snarling. I disagreed with him. I'm much closer to Chris. I think the trouble is that we're confusing between a nation and a state. Long live nations. I like nations. I like a girl with a brown face and a sari, or a black-faced girl, or a man with a good Scottish accent
But
with
that's
Gaelic
race.
songs.
That's nothing to do with nation.
On the contrary, it's nation.
I
I'm
can think
talking.
of many nations, most
Please,
of whose
Margaret,
people
you've
have brown
talked all
face.
night. Give somebody else a chance.
Well, be precise. Norman, you're pontificating and you're not being precise.
Would you please, you haven't defined independence yet. We'll see
All
about
right,
that.
all right.
May I?
Norman Buchan,
May I
please. Make
continue?
Norman make
There is
the
a
point.
difference between the nation and the state. I don't like states, Chris. I don't like states. They're apparatus of repression, inevitably. Nations are apparatus of culture, which I want to develop and flourish. And as Chris knows, there's probably no one in this room more than myself who's contributed his whole life on the development of the whole of the Scottish folk aspect, for example.
Thank you very much. Gentleman at the back there who's waiting to speak. That's you, sir.
When Paul Burns spoke there was a very interesting comment from down here, and it was the bloody English. That signifies the whole SNP attitude. The bloody English was said down here.
Right, I'll take it. Well, I didn't hear that. Was that a Cornish nationalist did we have? How did you get in? You come in with the pasties. Can I take the lady in the blue there? That's waiting to speak. The second row, yes.
Rosemary McKenna, Eastern Martinshire Constituency Labour Party. I think your programme's extremely valuable and I'm very glad it's going on down south because I think that tonight has shown the extremes of attitude in Scotland and I think Margot's performance tonight is quite incredible and I hope the Labour MPs and Tory MPs are watching tonight because if they are, they will see the kind of selfishness that is going to grow in Scotland if the devolution bill doesn't go through tomorrow, and that's what must happen. The guillotine must go through tomorrow so that we can put this devolution bill through and stop the terrible extremes of selfishness that are going to happen in this country if it doesn't go.
Is it selfish to want to cut down Scottish unemployment rate?
It's selfish if you want to take away jobs from England and bring them to Scotland. I have more in common with the working class in England than I have with the Lairds in the north of Scotland.
We are told that
Margot, please.
will take jobs from John
Margaret
Cassidy's
MacDonald,
Linwood
if you'll
to
allow me to
England.
chair it, we will get on a lot faster. Mr. Kellis and then Mr. Taylor hasn't spoken for a bit. Mr. Kellis in the front row here.
Yes, I've made a special study of Scottish politics at Glasgow University. And I think the trouble is not at all between Scotland and England and any kind of hatreds that there might appear to be between Scots and English. The trouble is right in the House of Commons. The MPs seem to be quite incapable of producing any constitutional reform, whether it be the House of Lords, the Common Market, direct elections to the European Parliament, and now devolution. They're unable to move. And of course, the cynic would say it's because it affects their own jobs. Here they are perhaps cutting their own throats. The Scots and the English are prepared to cooperate on this devolution scheme. The Labour Party conference voted it through 5-1. The Labour government presented a white paper which people accepted and now they produced their bill. Why on earth is it not getting through the House of Commons?
All right. I'm going to... Mr. Teddy Taylor, you were waiting to speak.
Yes, there was something I wanted to say to this lady here who said, we've got to get this devolution through, otherwise the nationalists will rise. This is what worries me. I have a feeling this bill, which honestly is a hodgepodge, if you'd heard the House of Commons debates, you'd have realised the kind of things which worry Tory MPs and Labour MPs. We've only taken up a third of the time. Do you honestly think this is going to answer nationalism? There's not one thing that the Scottish Assembly can do which can't be overturned by Parliament in this. There's going to be no separate revenue-raising powers whatsoever. It's going to simply be a question that instead of Eastern Bartonshire having one MP, they're going to have 3. And I'd say to Jimmy Airlie, how is it going to help the lads at Govan if you're a situation that you have, as well as your MP in Westminster, as well you're going to have 2 in Edinburgh when the powers are not clearly divided? For one thing you can be sure, so far as Govan and so far as Chrysler is concerned, your Scottish MPs in Westminster will have less effectiveness and there could well be fewer of them.
All right, thank you very much. I want to hear Jeff Shaw in the front row, and then I do want to bring in representatives of the Scottish Church. After Mr. Shaw, Mr. Fleming and Dr. George Reid, and then I'll call other speakers. Mr. Shaw first.
2 brief points, if I may. The first one is that I think that the SNP in particular
totally fails to understand what the historical movement at the moment is, and that there is, at grassroots level, in terms of local government, in terms of national government, a feeling of wanting to be more in control of our own destiny, if you like to put it that way. Now, devolution makes sense in that movement. What does not make sense is that the SNP carry along with it their idea of a total centralisation of power into the Assembly in Edinburgh. And they're going totally in the face of any of the really genuine movements towards a sharing down of power and a power to where people are. The second thing that we've got to nail tonight, and nail it good and firm, has come from Margaret MacDonald time and time again. We've got to recognise that the Scottish national view is not in terms of devolution for its own sake or in terms of an assembly for its own sake. It is only on the way to some other grabbing of power, and it is not in any sense on the way to a genuine sharing of power.
Not grabbing of power.
Reverend Fleming behind there. Thank you.
I find myself both in agreement and in disagreement with Mr. Taylor. I agree with him in the fact that this is not a satisfactory bill. But I find it very odd that he should start off as he did by saying that the people in Scotland were not interested in devolution.
I didn't exactly say that, in fairness now. Don't misquote it. What I said, it wasn't the most burning issue. And I don't believe it is.
Yes.
And I think we're kidding ourselves. We think that people are walking up and down saying, when is our devolution bill getting through?
All right,
what do your parishioners say?
Mr. Taylor, let Mr. Fleming make the rest of his point,
The
please.
Church of Scotland for the last 30 years has been pressing for devolution, and never once in these 30 years have we had a vote against the idea of devolution. And I must say that I go a long way with Hugh McDermott, because I feel this debate is tending to become too much on the economic and industrial level and not going down to the deep things. There is a national consciousness in Scotland which is being eroded and has been eroded certainly since the Second War, and which I believe can be developed again. And if it is developed again, it will be best developed through some form of devolution. And that will answer, in my view, a great many of the economic and industrial problems.
Dr. George Reid next, please.
Well, I'd like to underline very much what Mr. Fleming has been saying. Actually, the Church of Scotland's Committee on Church and Nation pled for devolution so far back as 1946, the year after the war. And indeed, the Church, of course, has been very much involved, and the Church's ministry, in this whole question long, long before that. Indeed, I think you could call the father of modern Scottish nationalism, and that's not necessarily, Margaret, the particular kind of brand of nationalism that we find in SNP, but the father of Scottish nationalism was a minister of the Free Church. He wrote a book in 1950, but he made the point, and this is what the Church is always saying, that no mere political manipulation will produce the kind of Scotland that we want.
Here, here.
We do need and this is one of James Begg's point, the father of modern Scottish nationalism. We do need a moral and a spiritual renewal. He meant this in the broadest possible sense. We want Scotland to arise from its apathy. We want certainly a new integrity, a new hope, and a new purpose in Scotland. And the other factor that I think has been neglected entirely tonight, you see, which the Church is very much concerned about, is, well, granted we have powers, granted we have fuller control over our affairs, to what end are we going to put it? To what kind of Scotland are we striving to lead? This seems to me the important part, and the Church, of course, has got important
Thank
things
you very
to
much.
say about that.
I'll take Mr. Turpey in the back row, in the third row back, who's been waiting to come in. Have I got the name right? Yes.
Yes.
Yes, thank you.
I want to make 3 points. The first is I really cannot stand the Hugh McDermott, Margaret MacDonald line. Here's to us, was like us, damn few and there are deed. And if you hate the English, clap your hands. Somebody made the point, it was Andrew Keir, that the UK is dead. Well, it's not dead. It's only dead if we all get round and start hacking it to death.
Mr. Turpey, may I just ask you that having attacked that kind of view, do you go some way, however, with, say, Mr. Fleming and Mr. Reid in this desire to prove your soul is Scots?
Yes, indeed. I want to make this point, that as a unionist, believing in the past and the future benefits of the United Kingdom, I still want to have a special assembly in Scotland, not to try and reduplicate and multiply the sort of government intervention in economics that we've had, which hasn't worked, but simply this, to allow the Scottish people to have made to them, as is possible in Scotland and at the moment is not in England, to have our own institutions of government made accountable to the people. The civil service that's already in Edinburgh, local government, the 63 national government agencies which work in Scotland but cannot report or be criticised by the Scottish people. That is within a context of the United Kingdom that would give us a spatial identity in Scotland, and that is what we in the Conservative Party are looking for.
No, Mr. Foulkes, you've been in. Stuart McLaughlin of the Daily Record newspaper, political correspondent. Your paper produced a rather surprising poll. Is that the view of the people of Scotland, do you believe?
Well, since the programme's going out to the people of England, I think I should make one point quite clear. I happen to agree with Terry Taylor, George Lawson, and most English MPs that devolution is not the burning issue in Scotland. Prices, jobs, housing, cost of living, these are the burning issues. But the answer isn't the one that Terry Taylor and George Lawson would give. The reason it isn't a burning issue is because the people of Scotland already think they have devolution. We've told them that there's a nice neo-Gothic building in Calton Hill in Edinburgh where the Parliament's going to sit. All the political parties have told them at the last 2 general elections that they would support devolution. We've told them how many MPs they'll elect to Edinburgh. They think they've got it. And this is the grave danger. If the guillotine fails tomorrow night, if the bill drops, it's not a question of the Westminster Parliament, and by that would appear to be English MPs saying, no, you're not getting devolution. It would appear we're taking it back from you. And I think, and I seriously believe that many English MPs are not really aware just how deep the devolution process has gone in Scotland, and if it is lost by party political bickering, like it does appear to be at the moment, then there'll be a very serious situation developing in Scotland.
We don't want just any bill just because it's called devolution. You truly agree with that?
All right, now I'm going to take the gentleman in the front row here who's been waiting to speak. Mr. Parnell, is it?
No, it's Joe Farrell,
Oh,
Scottish
Farrell,
Labour
I'm
Party.
sorry, I can't read my own writing.
I was wanting to make one point. There are very few people
Parnell
here.
was obviously going too far, wasn't it?
Very few people here, in fact, have defended the bill as it is, and certainly it's not any part of it's not none of our task to do so. The point is that we do need this bill to be passed because we require now a focus for Scottish opinion. Because there is one other factor which is not, in fact, featured in this discussion, and that is the fact that we're now in the European Economic Community. So that when people talk about customs barriers and so on, separating them from their kith and king in England, the question is straightforward. Have you ever heard of the Treaty of Rome? Do you know that the common market seeks to eliminate these sort of barriers? And if for people to come and try and scare us with this sort of talk really just won't wash any longer. The fact is that we're going to need representation there. The Scottish farmers and the Scottish fishermen already need it. And it's this sort of development we've now got to begin talking about. If Jeff Shaw talks about a process of history, he should remember that process of history as well.
Mr. Ross has been waiting to come in. Mr. Lawson, I'm very sorry. You've been in once. I just have to...
Yes, John Ross, I'm a Labour councillor in Glasgow. You talked about the bill being a hodgepodge. I think anyone that looks at the business of writing a devolution bill knows it's got to be a hodgepodge because you're trying to unscramble something. And I think that to straighten it out, the proper body to straighten it out will be the Scottish Assembly in negotiation with the Central Parliament. That's why we say let's get the bill now, those of us who support it. We can work out all the wee details later.
Okay. Is that Mr. Forbes behind you? Is it Mr. Forbes Graham from the Landowners Association? Can I hear from him? Mr. Forbes,
Graham.
is there?
No,
You're there,
Graham.
sir. Yes. Can I hear from you, please?
Mr. Graham, Engineering Union.
No, not Mr. Forbes, plainly.
It's all right. I can carry on.
No. All right, are you Mr. Forbes next to him? You are. I beg your pardon. Sorry, Mr. Forbes. May I hear from you? As landowners came into it a moment ago.
Thank you very much. I've been interested in the arguments tonight. They seem to be based on the sort of emotional issues rather than the practicalities. And I'm essentially interested in the practicalities. Now, I represent the rural industries, landowning, agriculture, and I happen to be chairman of the Scottish Woodland Owners Association. Mechanics of the bill see us divided into 2 camps. Agriculture remains non-devolved, and private forestry remains devolved. Now, you're going to have friction in the countryside. This is completely against our wishes, but this is what will happen.
Right, Mr. Graham, I'll let you in as you can. Thank you.
David Graham, Engineering Union.
And keep Scotland British.
Very much so indeed. And basically for my trade union views, I think we've got the chance here of alienating our brothers in the south and it's a very powerful view I've got. The reason I say that is that more and more of our union members are employed now in multinationals, and this amplifies the point that's been put across there. And it's more and more difficult for trade unions then in that situation to exert a counterbalancing pressure against the great economic pressures which the multinationals can exert. To at this stage introduce into our working class life a divisory issue such as an assembly must be is utter futility and folly as far as the trade union movement's concerned, because it does mean that instead of being brothers with our trade union brothers in the South, we're in actual competition with them.
Right,
I don't think it's possible to set up an assembly without it developing into that.
Thank you, Mr. Graham. I think it's an important point, and I think I'll ask Margaret MacDonald and Norman Buchan for a quick response to that.
Yes, well,
one at a time.
May I just make one point?
Sorry.
That Margaret doesn't interrupt next time somebody's asked to speak, including
Yes,
us.
Mr. Buchan, it would help me as well if you didn't interrupt her before she started.
I haven't.
And I haven't said a thing.
You don't have anything to say, Teddy.
Come on.
Mr. Graham started from the premise that devolution wouldn't help Scotland to cope with multinational capital and the effects of our having an unbalanced industrial framework because we have too much multinational capital actually in Scotland in comparison to the indigenous capital invested in indigenous industry. Now, I start from the opposite point of view. I would like to get to the stage where we can order the Scottish economy to have a different ratio entirely of Scottish indigenous money invested in Scottish industry, rather than always having to depend on multinationals. Because I take your point. There's much of what you say is true about devolution, but you see, from my side of the fence, I want to move to independence. And it's logical that we should move through this assembly first of all.
Right. Now, Teddy Taylor, I'll take you, Norman Buchan first on that particular point, Norman,
Well,
and then you, Teddy Taylor.
On this particular point, we still haven't had the definition of independence that we sought.
No, well, I meant Mr. Graham's point, I'm sorry.
Well, I think on this point, this is absolutely right. We've got to distinguish between economic powers and financial powers. Economic powers would mean that John Carty would have lost the jobs of 7,000 workers in his factory last Christmas, and we know that. It means that 5,000 workers in Babcock and Wilcox would lose it tomorrow with economic separation. Financial powers is a different thing. We should have financial powers in order to create the kind of Scotland we want. But I think we've got to see the Assembly as an element of creating the kind of tone and attitudes. We can change our social structure, our education, our health, and the morality, which may be different attitudes from the stuff that's come forward here tonight. But this we can do. But the prime point is this. What we are facing is a situation, both a bill and a situation in Scotland. The bill must go through, in my view, whether you're in favour of devolution or not, because it must be the Scottish people who should ultimately decide.
Teddy?
That is where the ball now is.
I'm glad Mr. Graham's spoken up, because a lot of trade unionists agree with him. Just ask the audience to think of one thing. If, in fact, you have the Assembly as proposed, with all the troubles that comes, the people who are most happy about it were the nationalists who hope to use it as a vehicle for independence. The one thing which worries me stiff is you could have 5 years of uncertainty in the course of which you find out whether this works or whether it leads to independence, and the one thing which will scare off industry, investment and jobs from Scotland is constitutional uncertainty.
Oh, that's not true.
All right, let me take... Mr. Blair hasn't spoken now. I've got 2 minutes left, ladies and gentlemen. If you quick points, please, all the way around.
Yes, very quick. I'm a Liberal councillor.
Yes.
And one thing that we are very much afraid of is that if we have a bad bill forced through by the guillotine, we'll end up through time in persuading the Scottish people that it is a bad bill. The most unpopular institution in Scotland is not Westminster, it is the Strathclyde Regional Council. And if we persuade the public that all we're going to get is Strathclyde writ large, we'll get a no in the referendum and devolution will be dead, and we in the Liberal Party will be very sorry about it.
Gentleman next to you, next to Mr. Whelan, thank you.
Alec Ferry, Chairman, Strathclyde Labour Party. I think, if nothing else, we've got to be honest in this programme, and in view of some of the remarks, we have got to repeat that the Scottish Trade Union Congress and the Scottish Council and the Labour Party are overwhelmingly in favour of this bill, and the British Trade Union Congress.
Right.
Well, no, just
Don't talk me out. I do want to get somebody else in, quickly.
Well, I've been sitting here all night.
All right, so there are other people.
The thing is that we have a commitment And every Labour MP in Parliament should vote in support of that commitment and let the people of Scotland decide not only the question of devolution but separatism, as Norman Buchan said.
Gentleman behind you.
It's got to be faced that the government had a majority of 40 odds on the second reading of the bill. They're now doubtful if they're going to get the guillotine through. They've dissipated the goodwill that there was for the bill in the House of Commons by their refusal to find consensus on it amongst other political parties.
Gentleman down here, that's right, that's you, sir, with the glasses and the beard. The one with the glasses, that's you. All right, I'm going to say good night. And if this is apathy, God knows what liveliness is.